So this is so exciting to get to talk with you about your work and about your leadership. I'm wondering if we could just start, though, with you telling us about your childhood and some of the experiences that were very formative for you.
Yes, I was born and reared in a little town west of Charlottesville, 12 miles, called Yancey Mills, Virginia. Sort of reminds you, can any good come out of Nazareth or Yancey Mills? I was so blessed to have been born into the family and the circumstances. I was raised on a little farm. My father's farm, my grandfather had established. My grandfather was born 15 years out of slavery and worked the coal mines of West Virginia, all the while building this little house and farm. I think he ordered it from the Sears Roebuck catalog and assembled it himself. I grew up in that house on that farm. A brother and a sister, I was the third. We lived 3 minutes from the church and the schoolhouse. The elementary school, 6th grade, one teacher, Mrs. Sue Ridley Williams. She stood about so tall, and she ruled that roost. Brilliant woman. Sixth grade, she one teacher. It was one of the old Rosenwald schools. You know, Julian Rosenwald gave money to help build schools as part of the Reconstruction. And that was a school that I got my start in. My community was a little tight-knit community of about 40 African-American families. I would say that there's several things about that period I want to mention. I would say that my introduction, first I'll talk about the high school I attended. My principal took a lot of interest. One of the people who at that point, maybe 3 or 4 people had taken special interest in my development and so forth. She took me to a national conference when I was a junior in high school. That's where I met Thurgood Marshall. He was then arguing the restrictive covenant cases in Detroit. That would have been mid-50s, mid-40s. I was school bus driver for the last 2 years of high school. I was 16 and 17 driving the school bus.
Did you have a license?
Yes, I did. And I never understood why the parents were so upset with this boy driving the school bus, What happened, Doc, about my senior year in high school, my aunt said, Grandpa Jesse, kind of like the guru of the community, Grandpa Jesse is about to leave us. He's up in age now. He can't be with us much longer. She said, I want you to go and interview him and get the history of our little settlement, that little community. He'd been a part of it right from after slavery. He was born 10 years before slaves were emancipated. So I got my little pencil and notebooks and things. I went to, by pre-arrangement, we sat in his backyard under the oak tree. He would come out and we would meet from 7 in the morning until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'd half an hour for lunch. That was his prescription for our meetings. That had been the rhythm of his life. And so he started telling me the story of how the land was acquired and all of that, and the church was built, the little school was built, and how they all, worked together to make that happen. And then he said, Brother Wood, I remember it like it was yesterday, the day we slaves learned that we'd been set free. He said, the young soldiers, I was 10 years old. I said, I believe I was 10 years old, he said. He said, the Union soldiers rode up on the plantation and said, get all the slaves together. And said, finally, after about 3 hours, we were all together out of the fields, big house. So we were finally together under this big oak tree. He said, the boy sat on a horse, the soldiers sat on a horse and took his paper and started reading, just read and read and read. And finally he stopped, finished reading, looked at us and said, nobody said anything. He said, we thought the old guru would say, he didn't say anything either. So the young boy started reading it again. So he read it, and finally it was finished, and he looked at us. He said, I don't think y'all understand. This paper says, Mr. Lincoln has set y'all free. He said, finally the old guru looked at the soldier and said, young man, whatever that is you say Mr. Lincoln done for us, go back and thank him. But we know that the great God Almighty didn't give us Jubilee. I didn't realize I had dropped my pencil. I'm sitting there with my mouth wide open, I'm sure, right? That became a seminal event in my life, all of my work, my scholarship and all, and I'll say a little bit later about why what we were doing with civil rights was a Jubilee light. We didn't get the whole impact of the economic and the spiritual. We got the spiritual, the social action, all that stuff, but we didn't get to the economic part of it, but that's what he gave me. When you understand the importance of Jubilee, you will understand why the first 50 years out of slavery was the most fruitful in terms of African American institutional infrastructure building. Out of slavery, first 50 years, acquisition of over 15 million acres of land, which is now down to 2 million and declining. The building of over 120 African American colleges and universities within that first 50-year period out of slavery. So Grandpa Jesse was actually the grandfather of my first cousins. And I would say that the impact on my life probably was probably second only to, but after my close family, of course, because I learned things from my father. He was a laborer at that point in his life, but he ran his own farm. And so he would give me assignments. He'd be leaving in the morning, and he'd say, now I want you to take me in the garden and say, look, these beans need to be weeded now. When you come home from school, get your, have your little snack, and then go and weed these beans, right? And he'd get home, and I'd be over at the neighbor's house entertaining. And he would drive in, and he would check right away. And I'd hear this, Virgil! I said, oh my God, I'm gonna get killed. I was a reluctant gardener. But I learned gardening. I think of myself now, Brother Sylvester, in the language of Thomas Jefferson, old man, yet young farmer. I think of myself as an old man, as a young farmer. And the work I do now, I think of it as farming.
So it's fascinating to hear you describe so many different dimensions of the community in which you grew up, and I'm wondering, before we talk about some of the activism that you became a leader in, if you could share with us some of the dimensions, more terror-stricken dimensions of dealing with the racism that structured the lives of people. Clearly, your lives were not reduced to that. You know, you enjoyed things, you had fun, you told jokes, you played games. But there's also a way in which today there is the general language about racism that focuses on discrimination that doesn't necessarily get to some of the terror of it. Some of the existential aspects, some of what it meant to wonder whether or not someone you and your family might go missing or something like that. But how did that dimension of it shape the lives of people in your community as well?
Well, the summer I went to college, I'm 17, there was an incident in our community. Louis Carter had just returned from the war, dressed in his uniform on Saturday night, adjacent town, something called a juke joint. You ever heard of the juke joint? You ever the juke joint? The juke joint. You know, the little entertainment spot and all of that. Well, Louis Carter had come out of the little nightclub-like thing, and this car comes through that little settlement, probably doing 90 miles an hour, hit him, and his body went up in the air and came down in pieces, literally came down in pieces. That was a real crisis for this community. I had actually helped to organize the county NAACP while I was early in high school, right? So when this thing happened, the men of the community, including my own daddy, called a meeting. And once they got the meeting set up, they literally put a chair in the middle of the room and said, sit there, right? Now, what do you think we should do? And this is a group of men, including my own daddy. And when I think back on that, it really astounds me.
They were asking you?
Yeah.
You should think, wow.
They tell me to sit in the chair there
Wow.
and say, what we're going to do? Well, they knew I had that, you know. So we finally decided that we had to go get one of the best lawyers we could find. And we got Spot Robinson out of Richmond, who is part of a law firm and students of, along with Thurgood, actually. They'd been classmates with Thurgood Marshall at Howard. We got Spot Robinson. He took the case. We got a big settlement for Miss Minnie, his mother. I think of that as a part of a rite of passage for me. And as I think back on it, it says a lot about my community, the health of my community. As they say, we got to do something, and we're not just going to let this go. Something has to be done, and they got some idea that I didn't know anything. It was actually Mr. Field Woods, who was a businessman, the lumber company and all of that, who really, you know, but he took me under his wing. We weren't related at all. His was spelled with an S, Woods, Field Woods, and I just rejoiced today because he said, well, we're going to go to Richmond Thursday. Let's go to Richmond Thursday. So I did a little research and all, got the appointments and things like that, and we went and talked with him. Got a nice settlement for Miss Minnie. So I've always been pleased about, as a community, piece. I want to say something about the nurturing that I had, just a little bit more about that, because as a family who would be classified as not wealthy, not middle class, not wealthy, we raised chickens, hogs, turkeys, and a huge garden. So that here's when I refer to myself as a gardener now. I think about the process of creating value, creating something that nurtures life, right? If you're going to grow vegetables, for example, we had a huge vegetable garden. We raised enough stuff that my mother would can vegetables and fruits in season. We'd have more vegetables and fruits in our pantry that lasts us the whole year. We didn't go to the store for anything but incidentals, salt, sugar, stuff like that. We raised our meats. We had a meat house there in the back there. In the fall, we would make our cider, big drums of cider, big kegs of cider. That was kind of a self-enclosed. When I was in elementary school, my dad said, "You old enough to do this." So he took me in the hen house. He said, "Before you go to school in the morning, I want you to put the chicken food in here for the chicken, the water and stuff during the day. And when you come home at the end of the day, gather up the eggs and put more water in there for the chickens," right? I think about that as getting me kind of in the flow of how do you sustain yourself in a non-market situation. But I also want to mention about when I'm growing up now, sitting at the dinner table, my grandmother, Grandma Callie, right? You would always have that Bible verse before the dinner, right? Her Bible verse always was, I once was young, and now I'm old, and I've never seen the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging bread. She was talking about the economy of abundance. That's what I was nurtured in, economy of abundance, where people were able to support themselves and then provide for some neighbors too who didn't have quite what what you had. Because I would bring in 3 dozen eggs a day. So we would have eggs, put some on the market. I think we probably ate more eggs. So you had your own cows, and so it was kind of like an economy of abundance on a small scale, a macro scale, That's in my blood, that the good Lord has provided everything that's needed to save every child on the planet, every child, every family on the planet. I believe that's a warrant, and I take it so as a result of my work with Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King. We'll say more about that, but I did want to double back into that childhood thing because I believe that the confidence that my folks had in having me to do these things played into my development in a way that was strategic. I didn't know, but that's part of the blessing. I've just been blessed so abundantly in the things that I was made to do, even when I didn't do them well. My older brother, Junior, would always cover for me. I feel bad about that now, but I thank God for him. He'd say, "Okay, I'll fix it. I'll finish it." He would do it.
That is fascinating. When you talk about the canning, it reminds me of something my mother would say from her childhood. She said that they had a saying: "You eat all you can, and what you can't."
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
That it was a similar kind of thing. It sounds like your family owned the land.
Oh yes, 40 acres. We had 40 acres.
And that made a huge difference. My mother and my father's, both of their sets of parents owned the land, and they could do that. They could raise, even though they were almost always cashless.
Sure, yes,
they were very poor in one sense.
That's right.
They had to make almost everything.
That's right.
Their shirts still had the label from the flour sack.
Yeah,
right?
I know about that.
They would bleach the flour sack and the words were still there. And they would dye the shirts, but she would talk about the fact that they raised their own meat, and they grew their own vegetables, and you can it, so when it was not growing season, you could still have some food to eat because it was not money to buy food.
Right.
Yeah. It was fascinating.
Eat all you can and can all you can. I like that. Who said that?
My mother told me that. She said they said that as they were children. She's amazing.
That story's going to travel, Doc. It has legs, I tell you.
Among the people you met, of course, one of those was Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
So could you talk with us about how you met and how your work together began to emerge?
Sure, absolutely. First time I ever laid eyes on Martin Luther King was in May of 1951. I'm a junior at Virginia Union. He has just finished Crozer Seminary and is driving back to Atlanta in May at the end of the school year at Crozer. He's going to Boston University in the fall. Some of the fellows, many of the graduate students at Virginia Union at that time were very senior people. They'd been veterans, they'd come back, so they knew King and all of that. And so he had stopped on our campus for a visit. So we all crowded into one of the graduate students' suite. I must have been 40 of us in that little suite. And there stands this little short guy expounding, It's the first time I ever laid eyes on him. Many of them knew him. They had known each other from their affiliation at the National Baptist Convention. King's daddy was, I think Daddy King was treasurer at one time. And so King was well versed in the hierarchy of the conventions and all. So a lot of fellows knew him. He had stopped in Richmond to address a student interracial council. Those councils at that time in the South were the folks who would deign to get together and do it. So he was going to address them. So that's the first time I saw him. That was 1951. I didn't really meet King. I was, just in a general gathering there. I was just there. But I didn't meet King until about 59. I went on his board in the next year. Ironically, our years overlapped in Boston. There was some overlap in Boston. I went to Boston in 52 for my theological work. He had one more year at Boston University at that time. When Rosa Parks on December 1 stood up for everything that she believed in by sitting down, I think that was one of the most momentous moments in the life of in the struggle of freedom for freedom. Here's this woman putting her life on the line. In fact, her husband never recovered from it. Mr. Parks never recovered from it. They were chased out of Montgomery after that, fugitives, so to speak, for a year or so. Finally, they arrived in Detroit. They were at Hampton for a little bit on the move, Mrs. Parks, Rosa Parks, and then my wife and I worked with her later, her work with children. And some of the work we do now, we feel is somewhat of an extension from what we felt when we were working with her. When Martin Luther King reluctantly accepted the presidency of Improvement Association that Friday, after E.D. Nixon had given preachers a scolding. You remember that story? He'd given the preachers a scolding. Nobody wanted to go front. King was a new preacher in town. Let this kid...
Tell us the story, because many people won't be familiar
Yeah,
with it.
that's right. Well, E.D. Nixon really was the godfather of that whole movement. Phil Randolph protege, working on a Porter, passing car Porter. And he had nurtured that whole thing. In fact, Rosa Parks was mentored by him. And she was kind of the key person in working with the youth division of NAACP. So her work with young people started very early. But when she refused to give up her seat, she told this story, and she told us this story over and over again, what was going through her mind. She had been to Highlander Folk School just 2 weeks before that. So she was kind of being led through a kind of a preparatory period that was not, set, but that's the way it happened. And when it was clear that, because we know that she was not the first to challenge, and the community had not rallied before. Part of the reason they rallied for her was because of who she was, and some people make an issue about class distinction, other young people and all that, but I don't buy that at all. E.D. Nixon knew how to coalesce. They've been trying to take that bus company on for a long time, as you know, and this seemed like just the perfect one. And so he was on the road when it happened, but he orchestrated the setting up of the boycott from the road. I don't know how they did it. They didn't have cell phones in those days and stuff like that. I don't know how they did it, but they got that thing going. And the women, Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Action Group, they started planning that thing right away, so that by the time Sunday came, they had all of those churches mobilized, so that the next day, the day of the boycott, December the 5th, the buses were empty. The buses were empty. And they realized that, no, we can't stop this thing now. So for 381 days, they carried it on. But it was E.D. Nixon who butted heads among the preachers. The preachers were scared to death. He said, stop acting like boys. He said to the preachers, stop acting like boys at him. We need you all to be leaders. And it was beautiful. I love that story. If you got prophets scared, it's a question of whether you're going to get into prophetic action. And I'll be honest with you, brother. When you know what's at stake for your people, and you know who some of the people are who can make a difference, I have gotten to the place I don't mind making a nuisance of myself to make people do what we must do to save every child on the planet. That's my mantra now, saving every child on planet Earth. And I believe that we have a divine mandate that says that if you stand in the way of any child coming into their fulfillment, the kingdom and so forth, kingdom of love, if you stand in the way of any child, it's better that you were never born. I think that's pretty clear. So at least I can spread that word and make a nuisance of myself if possible, if necessary, on behalf of the children and their families. We must save every child, but we must save their families as well. If we can't save the families, save the children, but let's try to save them both. That's the mantra of my work right now.
So I'd love for you to talk with us about your experiences that were very formative for you in shaping you into someone who could take on these fundamental struggles over justice, over racial equality, social change, and transformation. So what were things that you experienced growing up that helped to shape you into that person?
Well, a new pastor came to town when I was in my early teens, I guess maybe 13 years old or so. His name was Virgil Wood. He came to pastor Diamond Hill Baptist Church. And at the time, my father was membership secretary for the local branch of the NAACP in Lynchburg, Virginia. And Dr. Wood and my father became friends. Shortly after Dr. Wood had gotten there, efforts were afoot to desegregate the school system in Lynchburg. And the original suit started out with about 32 kids, but because of social and economic pressure from the majority community, that number got whittled down to 4. The 4 of us that ended up going forth in the suit, for the most part, our parents depended on the black community for their livelihood. My father was manager of Virginia Mutual Life Insurance Company, which was a black insurance company. There was a local dentist daughter. One of the participants' father worked on the train as a mail clerk. And so ended up 4 students suing the school system there. The courts made a decision based on supposedly IQ scores, and it was determined that Linda Woodruff and I would end up going to E.C. Glass High School January 29, 1962. Brenda Hughes and Cecilia Jackson came the beginning of the next school year. Ironically, we had to have higher IQ scores than 99% of the students that we were going to be going to school with at Glass. And so not only did I, become a school desegregator, but under the influence of Dr. Wood, I became, more of, I guess we were both called agitators at that time, and I became one of the youth leaders in the civil rights movement, and Dr. Wood served as my mentor and has been my mentor since that time. I was 14 when we actually desegregated the schools. 3 months later, Dr. Martin Luther King, at the request of Dr. Wood, came to Lynchburg to support our efforts. And of course, at that time, there were no Holiday Inns or Marriott hotels for African Americans to stay in when they traveled in the South. And so we stayed in homes of, local residents. Dr. King stayed at the home of Dr. Jackson. And after we had the rally that night at E.C. Glass's public auditorium, we went back to Dr. Jackson's house, and I vividly remember sitting in the floor with Dr. King singing freedom songs. So that was kind of the beginning of it all.
Can you talk a little about what was the sense of courage or audacity or motivation for taking on something which was a system of apartheid in the United States? This was a legal system, and it was well entrenched. Did it seem like an unrealistic thing to do at the time, but one that you needed to try to do? Was there a sense of confidence about it, that with the right strategies and the right scale of unity, that this was something that was feasible? Were you going into it both as an individual and collectively with the sense of some greater purpose, whether or not it was going to be feasible? What was that like?
Well, there was a kind of a genteel air that took place in Lynchburg, as opposed to what was happening, for example, a few miles down the road in Danville, Virginia at the same time. We didn't have the fire hoses and the dogs and those kinds of things that we saw in other parts of the South. There was certainly emotional, economic, and social pressure that was being applied, but we had a very close-knit community, and the rallies at the churches, the sit-in demonstrations, the marches, all of those just seemed like the right thing to do, and there was such community cooperation within the black community. There was such community support. We were made aware, for example, Linda and I, for a full half of a school year, were 2 black students in a school of 2,500 kids. And we were made aware that even as we made our way to school, and I usually walked to school, Glass was close enough for me to walk to school, we were made aware that there were people in the community that would take it upon themselves to watch over us as we made our way to school. So, we were in a crucible of a sense of safety on the one hand, but on the other hand, we understood that it was something that needed to be done, and there was a lot of support and cooperation that was taking place within the community. I never lost social contact with my African American peers, that were students with me. I was invited to all the parties and all the dances and all those kinds of things, in the black community. And so even though I was kind of rejected at school, at EC Glass, I was getting that kind of support and cooperation that I needed from my peers. And Lynchburg's not that big a city.
Wow, that's something. I think as I listen to you talk about this, I'm wondering what conflicts emerged over whether or how to implement certain strategies. So you say there was a lot of support, but I'm wondering whether also, given the entrenchment of these conditions of racial segregation and racial intimidation, whether there were some people who said, you know what, this sounds like a good idea, but people have gotten incarcerated, they've been killed doing this, maybe we should wait, or maybe we should try a different strategy. Were those conversations part of the concern or the consciousness of people in your community at that time?
Oh, of course. Of course. There were many who not only bought into the idea that was being promoted by the majority community, let's do this incrementally, let's wait a little while. There were those in the black community that were even promoting that idea themselves. But one of the things that I can't say about the inner workings in other places, but Dr. Wood and others that were in leadership position there made sure as youth leaders that we were brought in at the strategy level. And I remember we were in the process of making some plans to desegregate S&W cafeteria in our hometown. And we were brought in on the strategy sessions. We were helped to figure out how to be tactical in the way that we address that. And so, we felt very much a part of, and one of the things that I recently realized, and when I say recently, within the last couple of years, is that the youth movement that was taking place in Lynchburg actually predated the Birmingham Children's Crusade campaign. We were doing this in the summer of '62. The Birmingham Children's Crusade didn't take place until the spring of '63. And so, we were kind of doing those things on the ground. And then in '63, my father took me to the March on Washington. We were already, kind of in an activist position, and that just kind of reinforced how we were part of a bigger operation that was taking place.
So you also mentioned that a key formative experience for you was Dr. Virgil Wood coming and giving that talk in Lynchburg, and that he became for you a lifelong mentor and has remained that. So what has that relationship been like?
It's been a 58, 59-year relationship now that has been part and parcel of who I am. There have been three men who were influential in my life. My father, who's gone to rest, a mentor, Bishop Alfred Key, who's also gone to rest. Virgil is still around and still speaking into my life and still encouraging me and still challenging me, and hopefully it's a symbiotic relationship. Someone interviewed me the other day for an article that was being done, and they asked me about, when did I realize that I was a leader, and I said, it was kind of under the direction of Virgil, and it wasn't, wow, I'm a leader. It was, oh crap, I'm a leader now, So it's been, part and parcel. Virgil encouraged me to complete my PhD, for example. I participated. I got my PhD from a program at Union Institute and University that he was responsible for helping to organize. So ostensibly, because of that program, I'm not only a practitioner, but I'm a King Scholar. And all of that was because of the relationship that he and I have.
It has been a half century. Yeah. I would love to hear you reflect on the public memory of King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Civil Rights Movement, or the racial justice movement more broadly, particularly because we've reached a point in this country, so there is now a monument, Martin Luther King Jr. on the National Mall, and this person was an enemy of the state. He was treated as, in the words of J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI for many decades, as the most dangerous black person in the United States, the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States. He claimed that in 1967 about King. And we hear lots of very concise summaries of what that movement was about publicly. Now, we can talk about a more learned, scholarly understanding of it. What I'm asking you as someone who was part of it, to talk about to us about what it meant at the time and whether that connects well with how most people in our society today tend to think of the meaning of King and the work that you and Dr. Wood have done. And that is largely associated with some of the snippets that we hear that people have talked about justice being colorblind in a way that the King did not mean, for example, right? So what do you think about the public memory of this at the moment versus what you would like to emphasize about that history?
Well, one of them I've already kind of touched on. And I think people do a tremendous disservice to Dr. King specifically, and to SCLC historically, generally, in placing too much responsibility on their shoulders for the work that was done. I think the genius of what took place was what took place in the towns and hamlets and boroughs, across the country. That's number one. Number two, in terms of the monument, I've heard Virgil say on many occasions that King asked that those kinds of things not be done in his name. And so look at all the money that was spent on a monument that he never asked for. And if we don't at least create the funds that match what was done to memorialize him into an action fund, then again, we've done a disservice. And the last thing that I want to say about it is that I had to remember I'm a preacher and I can't say without what hit my mind. It bothers me to hear these sound bites of King as if that represented the totality of who he was, and to use those sound bites to justify actions that he never would have supported.